Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you folks, I have a brand new Star Trek Adventures video because today I'm going to be taking some time and I'm going to be talking about MACOs and Starfleet Marines all in the same video. And I think really the real place to pick up is with MACOs and First Contact. Essentially, the Third World War had essentially come to the end, or come to an end, because of First Contact in 2063 with the Vulcans, when basically humanity realized they were not alone in the universe. And essentially, the United Earth government would form, the UN would dissolve, and basically the joint space programs would end up becoming Starfleet, or at least the early incarnation of Starfleet, if you will. Meanwhile, many military forces would band together and form the United Earth Military. And this is essentially where we get MACOs, which is Military Assault Command Operations. And realistically looking at it, it kind of feels like to me that the MACOs is more like a special forces team within the United Earth Military Forces. And generally speaking, they would deal with ground combat. Now, when it comes to the roles they would fulfill in ground combat, they would fulfill many roles. Everything from demolition to sabotage, rescue operations, defense, assault, and so on. Also, during their time on the Enterprise, they would also train some of the personnel in more advanced combat, hand-to-hand combat tactics. And these MACOs that were on the Enterprise were actually there on the behest of Captain Archer, as the Enterprise was pretty much heading into more dangerous territory, and he even acknowledged that essentially Starfleet personnel was kind of found lacking and would have definitely been a serious threat if not having essentially a better trained force to help deal with said threats. Now, it did cause some tensions with the crew, which actually made for some interesting story points because, yeah, realistically, universally, Starfleet and MACOs are very different from one another. Starfleet essentially being a space navy, and MACOs essentially being Marines. However, with that being said, they did prove themselves invaluable during the situations, especially during the Xindi threat, and they would actually prove themselves invaluable once again during the Earth-Romulan War of 2156. MACOs during the war pretty much had found that they did not have a technological edge against the Romulan forces. However, what they did have a major foothold over was their training, their tactics, and their tenacity. And that made MACOs an absolutely devastating force against the Romulan forces during ground combat. And basically, when ground combat would break out, more often than not, the Romulans would elect to do orbital bombardments to destroy any Federation ground forces. Well, Earth ground forces, I guess you could say. However, even though MACOs had proven themselves time and time again, they were dissolved in 2161 with the formation of the United Federation of Planets. As essentially at the core, the United Federation of Planets was an exploration force, and essentially they kind of took over the role of defending Earth and the United other assets within the United Federation of Planets. And while at its core, it was essentially a peacekeeping force, if you will, It was more about extending olive branches and exploring the universe than military action, so it was decided to axe any military-based forces. And because of that, many MACOs would essentially leave Starfleet instead of joining Starfleet, or essentially MACOs, and pretty much go on to lead their own lives, whatever it was that they wanted to do or what they were going to do. Maybe some of them had retired. Who knows? Maybe some became freighter captains, became private security, whatever. While others would actually take the opportunity, stay with Starfleet, and actually become maybe something else or something more. There was some kind of bumpy spots, though, within that road. And you kind of know what I'm talking about if you've watched Star Trek Beyond. Now, I want to take a moment and I want to move on to Starfleet Marines. Now, Starfleet Marines are essentially unofficial, which is interesting. I'll get into why here in a little bit. But Starfleet Marines was around for the 4 Years' War. And this is actually because of the original source books made by FASA for the FASA Star Trek role-playing game back in the 80s. However, with that being said, this was not a completely alien concept to Star Trek, as Gene Roddenberry himself, who served in the Army Air Corps during World War II, had come up with several concepts for Starfleet Marines for the original series. However, with that being said, they were never featured within the original series whatsoever, and essentially all we ever got was Starfleet Security, aka the Red Shirts. However, I think we would start seeing concepts of Starfleet Marines bleed over later into Star Trek, especially the earlier movies, as well. There's these guys here who are definitely better trained than the typical Red Shirts and better armed. And, well, they actually got armor. So that's something different. And then in Star Trek V, we actually see a specialized ground tactical team, which once again, I do believe it's supposed to be Starfleet security, but they seem very militaristic and more prepared for a type of ground combat operation than essentially your typical Starfleet security. And then finally, we also have Colonel West. Now, there's a couple things here that grips me about Colonel West. He was a character in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. What grips me is he's, during a meeting, outlining a plan to actually land ground forces to rescue Kirk from Rural-Pinte, which is a mining prison, and even discusses ground assaults, ground teams, and basically a lot of his wording was very militaristic, including the fact that the idea was to do this quick assault and minimize the amount of casualties possible. However, the other thing that also grips me about this character is his rank. See, understand that Starfleet uses a lot of naval ranks, and Colonel is not a Navy rank. Colonel is used by the Army and the Marine Corps, which has me thinking a little bit more that behind these scenes, he was actually a Starfleet Marine. Now, of course, this would change by the time of the Next Generation, as the Next Generation essentially would basically double down on the idea of Starfleet being a peacekeeping force, and thus we would never see Starfleet Marines actually show up on the small screen or technically officially. Instead, we would just see a lot more security personnel die. And in my opinion, this is kind of unfortunate because, well, Starfleet probably could have used some Marines during the Dominion War. as more often than not, Starfleet would pretty much get their asses handed to them in ground combat with the Jem'Hadar. However, I do want to say that Gene Roddenberry's concepts of Starfleet Marines that he had back during the days of the original series would actually end up on the small screen as MACOs. Of course, this would be long after his passing, which is unfortunate because I kind of wonder what he would have thought about the idea of MACOs. And just some final thoughts. While I know there's a lot of people who may not necessarily like the idea of MACOs or Starfleet Marines, me personally, I do like the idea of MACOs and Starfleet Marines. It just makes sense from the standpoint of Starfleet is essentially the defense, if you will, of the United Federation of Planets. And while they are a peacekeeping force, they're essentially a majority of the duties would be taken up by security, but there's been several times over Starfleet's existence that they've actually needed some type of specialized ground combat troops for various different situations. And Starfleet has actually fought in several wars over its lifespan. I mean, you have the Xindi threat. Of course, you have the Earth-Romulan War. You have the 4 Years' War, which, while essentially FASA Star Trek's version of the 4 Years' War is not really canon, the 4 Years' War itself actually is canon. You have the Cardassian Border War. You have the Dominion War. You have the Borg invasion. And there's several other wars that I can't even really think of at this point. Because, yes, not everybody is going to greet you with a handshake and a smile. Some out there would rather greet you with a bullet to the head. That's just the truth. At least when you look at things on a galactic scale. Anyway, folks, what's your thoughts about MACOs and Starfleet Marines? And yeah, you can comment that down below. Anyway, folks, I'm going to wrap up the video at that today. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourselves a wonderful day.